Picture this moment if you will. It is December 7th, 1941, and the sun has barely begun to rise over the Pacific Ocean. The waters are calm, the morning air is still cool, and most people are just waking up to what they believe will be another peaceful Sunday. But high on a remote cliff overlooking the northern coast of Oahu in Hawaii, two young soldiers are staring at a green glowing screen that is about to change everything. They see something strange, something impossible, something that should not be there. Dozens of blips are moving toward them on their radar screen, coming from the north, flying fast and getting closer with every passing second. Their hearts begin to race. Their hands start to shake. They know something is terribly wrong, but nobody will listen to them. This is the story of how one small radar station, manned by two ordinary men who refused to be ignored, tried desperately to save an entire city from one of the most devastating surprise attacks in human history. This is the story of how technology, human intuition, and the courage to speak up almost prevented a tragedy that would drag an entire nation into the largest war the world had ever seen. This is the story of Apana Radar Station and the morning that changed America forever. To understand how one radar station nearly saved Pearl Harbor, we must first travel back to a world that was already burning. By 1941, World War II had been raging across Europe and Asia for more than 2 years. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe, from France to Poland, and his armies were pushing deep into the Soviet Union. In Asia, the Empire of Japan had been waging a brutal war of expansion across China and Southeast Asia, seeking to build what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Japanese military believed that their destiny was to dominate the entire Pacific region, and they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. Meanwhile, the United States tried to stay out of the fighting. Most Americans remembered the horror of World War I and wanted nothing to do with another European conflict. President Franklin Roosevelt and his military advisors knew that war was probably coming, but they hoped to delay it as long as possible. The problem was that Japan needed oil, steel, and rubber to continue its military campaigns, and most of those resources came from the United States and European colonies in Southeast Asia. When America began imposing trade restrictions and oil embargoes to pressure Japan into stopping its aggression, the Japanese military leaders faced a terrible choice. They could either abandon their dreams of empire, or they could strike first against the United States and try to knock America out of the fight before it even began. The Japanese chose war. Throughout the fall of 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto began planning the most audacious military operation in history. He would send 6 aircraft carriers with more than 350 planes across thousands of miles of empty ocean to launch a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. If the attack succeeded, Japan believed it would destroy America's ability to interfere with Japanese expansion for at least a year, maybe longer. The Americans would be so shocked and weakened that they might even negotiate a peace settlement. It was a massive gamble, but Yamamoto and the Japanese high command believed they had no choice. The attack was scheduled for the morning of December 7th, and it was planned down to the smallest detail. The Japanese fleet would approach Hawaii from the north, staying out of the normal shipping lanes, and launch their planes just before dawn. By the time the Americans realized what was happening, it would be too late. At least, that was the plan. But the Japanese planners did not know about a new technology that the Americans had been quietly developing for several years. It was called radar, which stood for radio detection and ranging, and it represented one of the most important technological breakthroughs of the entire war. The basic idea behind radar was surprisingly simple. You send out radio waves in all directions, and when those waves hit something solid like an airplane or a ship, they bounce back to you. By measuring how long it takes for the waves to return, you can figure out how far away the object is and in what direction it is moving. Scientists in several countries, including Britain, Germany, and the United States, had been working on radar systems throughout the 1930s, but the technology was still new and untested in real combat situations. The radar sets were large, temperamental, and often unreliable. They required constant maintenance and operators who really understood how to read the fuzzy green screens. But the potential was obvious. For the first time in history, defenders could see enemy planes coming from dozens or even hundreds of miles away, giving them precious time to scramble fighters and prepare defenses. The American military began installing radar stations at key locations around the United States and its territories in 1940 and 1941. Hawaii received special attention because everyone knew it was the forward base of the Pacific Fleet and a likely target if war with Japan broke out. The Army set up a network of mobile radar stations around Oahu, the main island where Pearl Harbor was located. These stations were positioned at high points around the island's coastline, giving them the best possible view of approaching aircraft. Each station had a small crew of men who worked in shifts, watching the radar screens around the clock for any sign of incoming planes. The problem was that radar was so new that nobody really knew how to use it properly yet. There were no clear procedures for reporting contacts, no established chain of command for dealing with radar warnings, and very little training for the officers who received the reports. The radar operators themselves were mostly young enlisted men with only a few weeks of training. They were learning on the job, trying to figure out what was normal and what was dangerous on those glowing green screens. One of these radar stations sat on a remote windswept cliff called Apana Point on the northern tip of Oahu. It was not an impressive installation. The radar set itself was housed in a large truck with a distinctive rotating antenna on top. A small wooden shack nearby served as the operations center where the operators watched their screens and made their reports. There were no permanent buildings, no real fortifications, and no weapons except the sidearms the soldiers carried. It was just a few men with a truck full of electronics, sitting on a cliff and watching for trouble that nobody really expected to come. The station was so remote that it took more than an hour to drive there from the main Army base at Fort Shafter, and supplies had to be brought up by truck over rough dirt roads. The men stationed at Apana worked 12-hour shifts, and when they were not on duty, they slept in tents or temporary barracks. It was boring, uncomfortable work, and most of the soldiers assigned there probably wondered why they were wasting their time on such a remote and seemingly pointless assignment. On the morning of December 7, 1941, two privates were manning the Apana station. Private Joseph Lockard was 28 years old and came from a small town in Pennsylvania. He had been in the Army for several years and had received more radar training than most of the other operators. He was considered one of the best radar men on Oahu, someone who really understood how to read the scope and interpret what he was seeing. His partner that morning was Private George Elliott, who was much younger and less experienced. Elliott had only been trained on radar for a few months and was still learning the subtleties of the equipment. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 in the morning, but their relief truck had not arrived yet. Lockard decided to use the extra time to give Elliott more practice reading the radar scope, since the young private needed all the experience he could get. It was this simple decision, this small act of mentorship on a quiet Sunday morning, that would put them in position to see something extraordinary. At 7:02 in the morning, George Elliott was sitting in front of the radar screen when he saw something that made him freeze. A huge blip had suddenly appeared on the scope, larger than anything he had ever seen before. It was not just a few planes. It looked like dozens of aircraft, maybe more, flying toward Oahu from the north at a distance of about 137 miles. Elliott called Lockard over immediately, and the more experienced operator confirmed what Elliott was seeing. This was no mistake, no equipment malfunction, no flock of birds. This was a massive formation of aircraft heading directly toward them at high speed. Lockard's mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be a flight of American bombers returning from the mainland? Could it be a naval patrol coming back early? But nothing made sense. There were too many planes, they were coming from the wrong direction, and nobody had told the radar stations to expect any friendly aircraft that morning. Lockhart knew they had to report this immediately. He grabbed the phone and called the information center at Fort Shafter, which was the central hub where all radar reports were collected and evaluated. But there was a problem. The information center was supposed to operate 24 hours a day, but on this particular morning, the officer in charge had decided to shut down operations at 7 o'clock because they did not expect any activity on a Sunday. When Lockhart called, the only person there was a junior officer named Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, who had very little experience with radar operations. Tyler had only been assigned to the information center for training purposes, and this was actually just his second day on the job. He barely understood how radar worked and had no real authority to make important decisions. But he was the only officer there, so he was the one who took Lockhart's call. Lockhart quickly explained what they were seeing on the radar scope. More than 50 aircraft, possibly many more, approaching from the north at approximately 137 miles out and closing fast. This should have triggered immediate alarm bells. This should have caused Tyler to pick up the phone and alert every airfield, every ship, and every commander on the island. This should have been the moment when Pearl Harbor woke up and prepared for battle. But Lieutenant Tyler made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told Lockhart not to worry about it. He said the contact was probably just a flight of American B-17 bombers that were expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. Tyler had overheard someone mention that bombers were coming in, and in his inexperienced mind, this explanation made sense. He told Lockhart to forget about it and end his shift. There was nothing to worry about. Lockhart tried to argue. He explained that this contact was much larger than just a few bombers. He said it looked like dozens and dozens of planes. He emphasized that they were coming from the north, not from the east where the bombers would be approaching from California. But Tyler would not budge. He was convinced that everything was fine, and he essentially ordered Lockhart to stop bothering him. Lockhart hung up the phone feeling frustrated and uneasy, but what could he do? He was just a private, and he had reported what he saw to a commissioned officer. He and Elliot continued to track the massive formation on their radar screen as it got closer and closer to Oahu. They watched as the blips moved across their screen at over 180 miles per hour. They could see the formation split up as it approached the island, with some planes heading toward the eastern side and others moving west. The two privates knew something was terribly wrong, but they had done their duty. They had reported what they saw. It was not their fault that nobody had listened. At approximately 7:48 in the morning, just 46 minutes after Lockhart first spotted them on radar, the first wave of Japanese aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor. There were 43 fighters, 49 high-level bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 40 torpedo bombers in this first wave, totaling 183 aircraft. They came screaming out of the morning sky with the rising sun behind them, and they caught the American Pacific Fleet completely by surprise. Most of the sailors on the ships anchored in Pearl Harbor were still eating breakfast or getting ready for church services. Most of the fighter planes at nearby airfields were parked in neat rows on the tarmac, wingtip to wingtip, making them perfect targets. The Japanese pilots could hardly believe their luck. There were no fighters rising to meet them, no anti-aircraft fire greeting them as they approached, no sign that the Americans had any warning at all. It was exactly what Admiral Yamamoto had hoped for, a perfect surprise attack that would catch the enemy completely unprepared. The Japanese torpedo bombers went after the battleships first. They skimmed low over the water and released their specially modified torpedoes, which ran shallow enough to work in Pearl Harbor's relatively shallow harbor. The torpedoes slammed into the sides of massive battleships like the USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, and the USS California, tearing huge holes below the waterline and causing catastrophic flooding. The dive bombers attacked from above, dropping armor-piercing bombs that had been converted from 16-inch naval shells. These bombs could punch through the thick steel decks of battleships and explode deep inside the ships, starting fires and destroying vital machinery. The fighters strafed anything that moved, shooting at sailors running for their battle stations, destroying planes on the ground, and generally creating chaos and terror wherever they went. Within minutes, Pearl Harbor was transformed from a peaceful naval base into a vision of hell. Ships were burning and sinking. Planes were exploding on the ground. Buildings were collapsing under the bombs. And hundreds of men were dying, trapped in flooded compartments or burned alive in fuel fires or cut down by machine gun bullets as they tried to reach their weapons. But here is what most people do not know about the Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese had a third target beyond the ships and the airfields. They had been ordered to attack the city of Honolulu itself if the opportunity arose. The Japanese military planners believed that terrorizing the civilian population would break American morale and make the United States more willing to negotiate a quick peace. Some of the Japanese pilots carried orders to strafe downtown Honolulu, to bomb civilian neighborhoods, to attack the city's power plants and water systems, and to generally spread panic among the population. If those attacks had been carried out, thousands of civilians, including women and children, could have been killed or wounded. The psychological impact on America would have been even more devastating than the military losses. The entire character of the war might have been different if the Japanese had successfully struck at American civilians in their homes and streets. Why did this not happen? Why was Honolulu spared? The answer goes back to that radar station at Apana Point. Even though Lieutenant Tyler dismissed the warning, and even though Pearl Harbor was caught by surprise, Lockard and Elliott's report had not been completely ignored. Some junior officers at Fort Shafter had heard about the radar contact and started making quiet preparations just in case something was wrong. A few fighter pilots were informally alerted. Some anti-aircraft gun crews were told to stand by. Most importantly, word spread through the military community on Oahu that something unusual might be happening. This created just enough confusion and just enough readiness that, when the attack actually started, the American response was faster and stronger than the Japanese expected. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire within minutes instead of the much longer delay the Japanese had anticipated. Some American pilots managed to get a few fighters into the air and shot down several Japanese planes. The Americans were hurt badly, but they were not completely helpless, and this made the Japanese pilots more cautious than they otherwise would have been. As the first wave of Japanese planes completed their attack runs and began heading back to their carriers, the strike commander faced a critical decision. Should he authorize attacks on Honolulu itself, or should the planes focus entirely on military targets? He looked at the situation and saw that the Americans were fighting back harder than expected. Anti-aircraft fire was filling the sky. He had already lost several planes and knew that more losses were coming. If he sent planes to attack downtown Honolulu, those aircraft would have to fly over heavily populated areas where there might be more anti-aircraft guns that he did not know about. The planes would be vulnerable, and they might get shot down over the city, giving the Americans even more propaganda value. He also knew that a second wave of Japanese aircraft would be arriving soon to finish off any targets that survived the first attack. He decided to play it safe and keep his planes focused on military targets. He ordered his pilots to avoid the city and stick to the harbor and the airfields. This decision was influenced directly by the fact that the Americans had shown some signs of readiness, some indication that they were not completely asleep. The Japanese commander did not know about the radar contact or about Lockard and Elliott's warning, but he could see the results. The Americans were responding faster than they should have been able to if they had been completely surprised. This made him cautious. This made him conservative. This made him keep his pilots away from downtown Honolulu. In this indirect way, the radar station at Apana Point had saved the city. If there had been no warning at all, if the Americans had been even more unprepared, the Japanese might have felt confident enough to attack civilian targets. But that tiny hint of readiness, that small indication that something had gone right somewhere, was enough to make the Japanese stick to military targets. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived about an hour after the first, bringing another 167 planes to continue the attack. By this time, the Americans were fully awake and fighting back with everything they had. Every anti-aircraft gun on the island was firing into the sky. The few American pilots who had managed to get airborne were diving into the Japanese formations. The harbor was covered with smoke and fire, making it harder for the Japanese bombers to find targets. The second wave faced much fiercer resistance than the first, and they paid a higher price in lost aircraft. When the attack finally ended around 10 in the morning, the Japanese had achieved a tactical victory, but not the complete annihilation they had hoped for. Yes, they had sunk or damaged 8 battleships. Yes, they had destroyed nearly 200 American aircraft. Yes, they had killed over 2,400 Americans and wounded more than 1,000 others. But they had not destroyed Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, which held millions of gallons of irreplaceable oil. They had not destroyed the repair facilities, which would allow damaged ships to be salvaged and returned to service. They had not destroyed the submarine base, which would become crucial in the Pacific campaign. And they had not attacked Honolulu, which meant the civilian population was intact and angry rather than terrorized and demoralized. Most importantly, the 3 American aircraft carriers that normally called Pearl Harbor home were out at sea that morning and escaped damage completely. These carriers, especially the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, would become the backbone of America's counterattack in the Pacific. Within 6 months, American carrier planes would win the crucial Battle of Midway and turn the tide of the entire war. None of that would have been possible if the carriers had been caught and destroyed at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had gambled everything on this one surprise attack, and while they won the battle, they ultimately lost the war. Admiral Yamamoto himself reportedly said that all they had done was awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve. He was more right than he knew. What happened to Joseph Lockard and George Eliot after that terrible morning? For a while, they were treated as heroes who had done their duty despite being ignored. Military investigators interviewed them extensively, trying to understand exactly what they had seen and when they had reported it. Their testimony became crucial in the various investigations and hearings that followed the Pearl Harbor attack. Congress wanted to know how such a massive failure of intelligence and readiness could have happened, and Lockard's detailed account of his radar contact and his phone call to Lieutenant Tyler became a key part of the story. The 2 privates had done everything right. They had spotted the Japanese formation at maximum radar range. They had reported it immediately through proper channels. They had even argued with their superior when he dismissed their warning. They could not have done more with the authority and resources they had available. But as the months passed and the shock of Pearl Harbor began to fade, the story of the Apana radar station became complicated and uncomfortable. Yes, Lockard and Eliot had detected the attack in time to potentially save lives and reduce damage. But why had nobody listened to them? Why had Lieutenant Tyler dismissed such an important warning? Why was there only one inexperienced officer at the information center on a Sunday morning when tensions with Japan were so high? Why did the radar stations not have better procedures for reporting contacts and getting quick responses? The more people asked these questions, the more the radar warning became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong that morning. It showed that America had the technology to defend itself but lacked the training, procedures, and leadership to use that technology effectively. The radar warning became an embarrassment rather than a triumph. Joseph Lockard went on to serve throughout the rest of World War II, working with radar systems in various locations. He survived the war and returned to civilian life, rarely speaking about his role in the Pearl Harbor story. George Eliot also continued his military service and later worked as a radar technician. Both men lived long lives, and both carried the knowledge that they had tried to save Pearl Harbor and had been ignored. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler faced intense scrutiny and criticism for his decision to dismiss the radar warning. Multiple investigations examined his actions that morning, but ultimately no charges were filed against him. The official conclusion was that he had made an honest mistake based on inadequate training and unclear procedures. He continued his military career and actually had a successful time as a pilot in the Pacific, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. But the burden of that one decision on that one morning stayed with him forever. The radar station at Apana Point itself remained operational throughout the war, continuing to watch the skies over Hawaii and providing early warning for any future attacks that thankfully never came. After the war ended, the station was gradually dismantled as newer and better radar systems replaced the old mobile units. Today, there is a small memorial at the site marking the location where Lockhart and Elliott made their historic sighting. Visitors can stand on that windswept cliff and look out over the ocean toward the north, imagining those two young soldiers staring at their radar scope and watching death approach their island. It is a quiet place now, peaceful and largely forgotten, but it represents one of the most important moments in American military history. Historians have spent decades analyzing what might have happened if Lockhart's warning had been taken seriously. The consensus is that even with just 30 or 40 minutes of advance warning, Pearl Harbor could have significantly reduced its losses. Fighter planes could have been scrambled to intercept the Japanese formations before they reached the harbor. Anti-aircraft guns could have been fully manned and ready to fire. Ships could have been put on high alert with damage control parties standing by. Watertight doors could have been sealed and ammunition could have been distributed. None of this would have prevented the attack entirely, but it would have made the Japanese pay a much higher price and would have reduced American losses considerably. Some historians believe that with proper warning, the Americans might have shot down 50 or more Japanese planes in the first wave alone, which would have been such heavy losses that the second wave might have been canceled. The entire character of the attack could have been different. But the even more important question is what would have happened if the warning had led to an evacuation or protection of Honolulu. If American commanders had taken the threat seriously enough to warn the civilian population and prepare civil defenses, and if the Japanese had still decided to attack the city, the massacre of civilians could have been prevented or minimized. Thousands of lives could have been saved. The psychological impact on America could have been less severe. Or perhaps, if the Japanese had seen that the Americans were fully alert and ready, they might have called off the attack entirely, reasoning that they had lost the element of surprise. We will never know what might have been, but we do know that two ordinary soldiers gave their country a chance to avoid disaster, and that chance was thrown away by confusion, inexperience, and the simple human failure to believe that the worst could actually happen. The story of the Apana radar station teaches us lessons that remain relevant more than 8 decades after the attack. It shows us the danger of dismissing warnings from people on the front lines just because they do not fit our expectations or because they come from low-ranking individuals. Lieutenant Tyler was not a bad officer or a foolish man. He simply could not believe that what Lockhart was telling him could be true. His mind found a comfortable explanation that allowed him to ignore the warning and go on with his morning. We see this same pattern repeated throughout history whenever catastrophic failures occur. Someone somewhere usually sees the warning signs and tries to sound the alarm, but they get dismissed or ignored because people in authority cannot accept that disaster is really coming. The story also shows us the importance of training, procedures, and clear chains of command. The radar technology worked perfectly that morning. The problem was not the equipment but the human systems surrounding it. Nobody had established clear rules for what radar operators should do when they saw large formations of aircraft. Nobody had ensured that the information center was properly staffed at all times. Nobody had trained junior officers like Tyler on how to evaluate radar warnings and make quick decisions. The technology was ahead of the tactics and organization, and people died because of that gap. This same pattern has repeated countless times in military history and continues to this day. We develop amazing new capabilities, but fail to build the human systems needed to use those capabilities effectively. Perhaps the most important lesson from Apana Point is about the courage required to speak up when something is wrong. Lockhart and Elliot were just two young enlisted men sitting in a remote shack on a Sunday morning. They had no power, no authority, and no influence. When they saw something alarming on their radar scope, they could have simply ignored it. They could have convinced themselves that it was probably nothing or that someone else would handle it. They could have worried about looking foolish if they were wrong or about bothering their superiors with false alarms. Instead, they reported what they saw immediately and clearly. When they were told to ignore it, Lockhart argued back, even though he was talking to a commissioned officer who could have made trouble for him. He did everything he could within his limited authority to make people take the warning seriously. This kind of moral courage is rare and precious. In every organization and every institution, there are moments when someone sees danger coming and has to decide whether to speak up or stay quiet. The pressure to stay quiet is always enormous. You might be wrong and then you will look stupid. You might be right, but people might get angry at you for causing problems. You might be overstepping your place or bothering important people with trivial matters. All of these fears are real and legitimate, but sometimes staying quiet means people die. Sometimes staying quiet means disaster becomes inevitable. Lockhart and Elliot chose to speak up, and even though they were ignored, they did the right thing. They fulfilled their duty. They gave their country a chance. The failure was not theirs. The Pearl Harbor attack and the radar warning that could have prevented it marked a turning point in military technology. Before World War II, warfare was still largely a matter of what you could see with your eyes and hear with your ears. Armies and navies fought during the day because fighting at night was too difficult and confusing. Surprise attacks were relatively easy to pull off because defenders could only see a few miles at most. But radar changed everything. Suddenly, defenders could see hundreds of miles in any direction, day or night, through clouds and fog and darkness. Aircraft could be tracked from the moment they took off until the moment they landed. Ships could be detected far over the horizon. Submarines running on the surface could be spotted from aircraft. The advantage that attackers had enjoyed for thousands of years suddenly shifted to the defenders. The rest of World War II saw a technological race to improve radar and develop countermeasures against it. The British used radar to win the Battle of Britain, detecting German bomber formations early enough to scramble fighters and position them for intercepts. The Germans developed radar to defend their cities against Allied bombing raids. The Americans used radar to guide their fighters to Japanese aircraft and to aim anti-aircraft guns with deadly accuracy. Radar-equipped aircraft hunted submarines in the Atlantic Ocean and sank them by the dozens. By the end of the war, radar had become so important that both sides had special units dedicated to destroying or jamming enemy radar stations. The technology that had been so new and uncertain on December 7, 1941, had become the foundation of modern warfare. While we tell the story of how the Apana radar station almost saved Pearl Harbor, we must never forget the more than 2,400 Americans who died that morning despite all warnings and all technology. These were sailors trapped in the capsized hull of the USS Oklahoma, pounding on the metal and screaming for help as the water rose around them. These were pilots burned alive in their planes on the ground before they could even start their engines. These were civilians hit by falling anti-aircraft shells or by the few Japanese bombs that fell outside the military areas. These were young men, most of them barely 20 years old, who died suddenly and violently while eating breakfast or writing letters home or getting ready for church. They had no warning, no chance to fight back, and no time to say goodbye. Their deaths were tragic and wasteful and enraging, and they deserved better from their leaders and their country. The story of Pearl Harbor is ultimately a story about the price of unreadiness and the terrible consequences of ignoring warnings. America, in December 1940, was a nation that wanted peace but had not prepared for war. It had the technology to defend itself, but lacked the will and the organization to use that technology. It had dedicated soldiers and sailors who were ready to fight, but leaders who could not believe that fight was coming. The Japanese took advantage of all these weaknesses and dealt America a blow that should have been crippling. But they made one critical mistake. They failed to completely destroy American capability, and they underestimated American determination. The sleeping giant woke up angry, and that anger fueled a war effort that would not stop until Japan was utterly defeated. The Apana radar station represents all of this complexity in one small story. It shows us American technological skill in developing radar in the first place. It shows us American dedication in the two young soldiers who watched their screens faithfully even during what should have been peacetime. It shows us American failure in the officers who could not believe the warning they received. It shows us American resilience in the speed with which even a surprised and damaged fleet fought back against its attackers. And ultimately, it shows us that history often turns on small moments and small decisions made by ordinary people who have no idea how important their actions will become. If Lieutenant Tyler had taken the warning seriously, if he had sounded the alarm, if Pearl Harbor had been ready when the Japanese arrived, the entire Pacific War might have unfolded differently. Japan might have lost so many planes in the attack that it would have crippled their carrier fleet immediately. America might have suffered so few losses that it could have gone on the offensive months earlier. The war might have been shorter, and thousands of lives might have been saved. Or perhaps the Japanese, seeing that they had lost the element of surprise, would have called off the attack and tried a different strategy. We will never know. What we do know is that two privates at a remote radar station gave America a chance, and that chance was not taken, and the consequences echoed across the next 4 years of global war. Today, when we think about Pearl Harbor, we should remember not just the ships that burned and the men who died, but also the warning that was ignored. We should remember Joseph Lockard and George Elliott staring at their radar scope and knowing that something terrible was coming. We should remember them making that phone call and trying desperately to make someone listen. We should remember that they represent everyone throughout history who has seen disaster approaching and tried to warn others, only to be dismissed or ignored until it was too late. Their story is a reminder that the most sophisticated technology in the world means nothing if we lack the wisdom and humility to listen to warnings, especially when those warnings come from unexpected places and challenge our comfortable assumptions about how the world works. The one radar station that almost saved an entire city teaches us that preparedness matters, that training matters, that procedures matter, and that listening matters. It teaches us that technology alone cannot protect us if we do not build effective human systems around that technology. It teaches us that courage means speaking up even when you know you might be ignored. It teaches us that junior people sometimes see things that senior people miss, and that rank and experience do not guarantee wisdom. Most of all, it teaches us that small actions can have enormous consequences, that ordinary people can find themselves at the pivot points of history, and that doing your duty matters even when it seems like nobody is paying attention. The green glow of that radar screen on December 7, 1941, showed dozens of blips moving toward Hawaii carrying death and fire and war. Two young soldiers saw those blips and understood what they meant, and they tried to save their country. That they were not able to prevent the attack was not their failure, but the failure of a system that was not ready to hear bad news or believe that the worst could happen. Their story should inspire us to build better systems, to listen more carefully, to take warnings more seriously, and to remember that vigilance is the price of safety. The city of Honolulu was spared the full horror of that terrible morning partly because of what those two soldiers did at Apana Point. Thousands of civilians who never knew how close they came to disaster owed their lives to a warning that was given but not fully heeded. That is the final lesson of the one radar station that saved an entire city. Sometimes saving lives does not mean preventing disaster entirely. Sometimes it just means making disaster a little less terrible, giving people a slightly better chance turning catastrophe into tragedy instead of annihilation. That is what Lockhart and Eliot did that morning, and it was enough.